This is Office Hours with SIU System President Dan Mahony, a monthly podcast that explores what's happening in and around American higher education. And now your host, SIU System President Dan Mahony.
Thank you for tuning in to Office Hours. I'm your host, SIU System President Dan Mahony. I've been at higher education institutions now for over 40 years, and one of the most confusing things to those outside of higher education, and even to those sometimes inside higher education, who is really in charge of the university? When we ask this question, the average person, I think, generally says it's me, the university president. However, I report to a board of trustees, which actually sits on the top of the organizational chart. While the board is at the top and has significant power, they are not, and frankly, could not be involved in every decision at the institution. So there's a lot of power that is spread out throughout the organization, including in the hands of faculty, staff, other boards as well. And these groups take the lead on various decisions that are made. So to answer the question of who is in charge is really a lot more complicated than I think most people realize, and more important to understand. Behind every major decision, whether it's leadership transitions to tuition increases and long-term strategy, there's a dynamic balance of power that shapes the future of a particular institution. So in this episode of Office Hours, Who's the Boss Inside University Power and Governance, we're going to focus specifically on the role of the Board of Trustees and how effective boards manage and leading their institutions from a position at the top without directing, again, every important decision. We're grateful to be joined today by an outstanding group of guests who will bring both research and real-world experience in university governance. And that includes some of our own SIU system board members, our chairman, Judge Phil Gilbert, and a former board chair and longtime supporter of SIU, Roger Tedrick. But we're going to begin with a broader and more global perspective from Dr. Felecia Commodore, who is an associate professor of education policy, organization, and leadership at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and focuses her research on governing boards. And I've heard her present before and always is very informative. So Dr. Commodore, welcome. We're happy to have you here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Now, can you explain the role of governing boards, and does that change across institution types, and how is it different from other university-related boards?
Sure. So I think the core of what governing boards do or their responsibilities pretty much is the same across institutional types. They are what we call the fiduciaries of the institution, and ultimately their goal is to ensure that the institution is making decisions, engaging in practices and policies that not only ensure the health of the institution, but also protect the institution from anything that might be a threat to their health, whether that be legal, financial, political, things of that nature. And so ultimately, regardless of institutional type, that their role is to really be there to ensure that the institution has long-term sustainability. Where you may see some nuance institutional types is really the when we look at boards at what we say private institutions or independent institutions, they have a little bit more of just a fiduciary to that institution, and really thinking about the kind of the local or just the that specific institution. Where when we look at public institutions, where those board members often have to kind of find a balance between thinking about the institution, but also thinking about the larger implications with the state that they're in, state policy, state funding models, as well as if they're in a system like the SIU schools or the UI schools, thinking about their relationship with the system as well. And if there's a system, what we call system level governing board, also their relationship with that. So those are the nuances, but at the core, their jobs are really to make sure that the institution is doing things that are legal, and that it's staying healthy both fiscally and as far as its practices.
Yeah, no, I think you hit on a couple of important things there. Certainly the fiduciary is the thing that always comes to my mind. And some of that is managing and being aware of risk and determining what kind of big risk the institution wants to take. But I think you also hit on the importance of We always talk about public universities being a public good, and their role is to make sure that we are being that public good for the state. Now, there's different ways of appointing people to governing boards, and I've been in multiple states, and I think each was a little bit different in how they did it. Are there ways in your mind, like how are they appointed generally, and are there ways that are better or worse from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there, as you said, there are nuances in how board members are appointed. In the public space, we see that it does vary from state to state. Generally speaking, usually the appointment is coming from a gubernatorial administration. And usually there's some kind of confirmation process that involves the state legislature. In some states, it does come from the state legislature itself. And then there are a few states, like one or two, where there's a few positions that are elected by the general populace. That's not as popular of one, but that does happen in a couple of states. And then with private institutions, we call self-perpetuating boards. And so those nominations come from board members who are already on the board. And then there's a process in which they are elected by board members. And so those board members at private institutions tend to come from different networks that are connected to the board. I don't know that I would say that I believe any one particular method is better than the other. However, what I will say is that I think it is a best practice for boards to, regardless of how they're being appointed, boards and those who are doing the appointing, whether that be a state legislator or gubernatorial administration, really think about the needs of the institution, really think about the demographics of that institution, who the institution is serving, the community that those institutions are in, what are the strengths, and then also areas that need development for that institution, and really thinking about board membership and who serves on boards. I like to argue as a strategy, as part of strategic planning for the institution, as opposed to just placing board members or nominating board members as a political reward, or just as a opportunity to have someone be able to put something on their resume that they do. But really thinking about how we can use board appointments as strategic planning for the institution.
Yeah, and that actually leads nicely into my next question is kind of what generally are the backgrounds of people on governing boards, and what recommendations would you make to kind of ensure that a governing board has that kind of broad type of expertise and perspectives that makes for a healthy organization?
Yeah, so when we look at boards, particularly public boards, most board members come from some sector of business industry. So a majority of our boards are from business, whether that is entrepreneurial business, or if that is corporate business, but that is usually their background. And then I would say the next one up would possibly be law. We see people from legal backgrounds. And I think that doesn't shock many of us who kind of work with boards or know boards, because part of a board's main role is fiscal development. So our folks who are connected with corporations and major corporations often have access to high financial capital that they can act as a conduit for the institution. However, what I suggest, or what I would recommend, is, though that is important, we don't make that the only way in which we gauge or we evaluate whether someone could be a really great asset to a board. One of the things that when I work with boards who are thinking about their composition, how they can have the most robust composition for their board, one of the things we encourage them to do is to do some asset mapping. And what that allows them to do is think about what are their strategic goals for their institution, what are they trying to do, what are they trying to bolster, what are they trying to maybe improve, where they're heading, and then look at their board and see what demographics, what skill sets, what backgrounds are already present on the board, but then also what is not present on the board. What are some skill sets, some networks, what demographics that may be absent from the board that could serve well to help them reach or move towards the goals that the institution has. And when they're able to identify those gaps, that helps them think about how can we strategically recruit people to the board who can fill those gaps. And I know with public boards that can sound a little tricky because they're like, well, we don't put people on our board, right? But I think the role for public boards when they are able to engage in this exercise is to then work with their state legislators, the governor, to bring people into the network so that when it comes time for the administration to appoint members, folks that they're looking for are already kind of in the network and in the mix to be able to do that. And they're they've made the administration aware of who people might be that they can that would be good for the institution and fill those gaps. And then the last thing I'll say is, I think particularly for public institutions, one of the things that we've seen is that public institutions, often their boards don't look like their campuses. And so thinking about how we can make sure that we have board representation and board composition that reflects who's going to our campus, who's being served by our campuses, to help make sure that as we're planning policies, setting budgets, doing agenda setting as a board, we have voices in the room that truly represent the diverse communities that are on our campus and the different constituencies we're serving on our campus.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, I think, of making sure you get that representation. It's interesting, of course, in Illinois, we have students who are board members, and that's one of the ways of making sure that voice is at the table. I know some places have had faculty or staff representatives on the board as well sometimes to make sure that that's there, but there's other ways of doing that in appointing boards members who have those connections. And I would say my experience has been similar to what you just described, of a lot of people from business, a lot from the legal field. But I think a lot of them, at least what I've seen when it's most effective, do have that conversation of what is it we're missing every time there's an opportunity to appoint. I think what is surprising to a lot of people, and I talk about this in my class when I teach, is that very rarely educators. So in a higher education institution, which isn't necessarily, I think, a bad thing. I don't know your perspective, but it's because we're not really asking them to be actively involved in those kind of day-to-day decisions and really have a different role, that fiduciary role, that public good role. I'm not sure actually actively being an educator is a necessity to do what their role is. But I don't know what your perspective is on that.
Yeah. So I'm a little biased.
Yeah.
But I think balance is always good. Is having a diverse group of folks there to have experts in higher education specifically, or people with that background who maybe have worked at an institution or worked in policy spaces in higher education on boards, because there is unique insight that they have about the sector, about trends in the sector, about different high impact practices. And also one of the things we find sometimes with boards is that higher ed sometimes has unique data sets and data points that are often used in evaluating policy, crafting policy, that often sometimes can be tricky to interpret for folks outside of the sector who have not worked on campuses. And so there's a role that board members who have that experience or have that background can play in helping with some of the data literacy and data interpretation that you might be getting from your provost or your VP of student affairs and things of that nature. So I do think that having folks with that background in a particular kind of professional way can be helpful. Higher education is it's one of these unique fields where everyone thinks they understand it because they participated in it, right? And so So, and so sometimes it can be a little tricky to navigate conversations because folks feel like, well, when I was in college, this worked best, and I think this is what we should do. Or I sent a kid to school last year, and these are things I didn't like, and so I don't think we should do this. And I don't knock any of those things. I think they're great experiential knowledge, but I think what can help counter that is having someone who really has a technical expertise in higher education to kind of help let's help kind of filter those things through the lens of what we know about how higher education works. So I think it can be helpful, but always I think you want a diverse representation of backgrounds and knowledge on the board.
Yeah, so getting back into the notion of balance, and I think that's a good perspective. And again, having people who have a broader understanding of higher ed beyond their institution. I'm always amazed sometimes when people think what's happening at their institution is entirely unique and it's really part of a national trend. And so someone who would understand what's happening here is happening a lot of places, it could be valuable.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I think if I can add one thing really quickly, I think also it's important because sometimes folks see national stories or things in Forbes.
Yeah.
And they can also have visceral reactions that are and want to act on things that they haven't quite placed in context, right? And so I think having someone who has that broader understanding of higher ed can help place those stories that might turn into fires for folks or emergencies into proper context so that we don't make rash decisions based on kind of just trends that we're seeing.
Yeah, well, that actually leads me to another question is how do board members ensure that they're well informed about the university and higher education in general, and so they can make better decisions and more informed decisions?
Yeah, so I think having your pulse on kind of some of the major kind of overarching stories that we see in places like the Chronicle of Higher Ed or Inside Higher Ed, but I think also just paying attention to policy trends, especially now we're seeing a lot of different higher ed policies coming from state legislatures. We're seeing a lot of changes at the federal level. And so I think it's important for boards to keep a pulse on those things. Maybe not necessarily feel you have to react to everything, but just being in the know. I think the other thing, and again, I might be a little biased, but I think the other thing I think could be really helpful for board members is to look at who are the experts in certain areas in higher education, whether that is in scholarly spaces, but also when we think about in the philanthropy and policy space as well. So if we know one of the things that we are trying to do is increase our retention, we don't want to only look at what are other institutions doing to increase retention, which tends to sometimes be what we see boards do in higher ed is like, oh, that school seems to be doing well, let's do what they're doing. But look at who are some of the scholarly experts in retention practices and getting a hold of some of their work. Now that means that scholars in higher education have a responsibility to have work that is easily digestible, and that board members can understand, and that there's a responsibility there. But I think there's a lot of information, both in, we have policy briefs and research briefs and different experts out there, but I think there's often a gap between the folks who are scholars in that area and experts in that area and what board members find coming across their desk and in their purview about certain areas. And so I think being able to close that gap and then having some knowledge translation there could really be helpful. And I think being proactive in that, and so not waiting until we're having an emergency to figure out who we can talk to, but bringing people into retreats, bringing people into meetings, to talk about what is it that we know about retention, what is it that we know about enrollment trends, what is it that we know about federal financial aid policy and how it impacts particular demographics, what is it that we know about you know, food insecure students and things of that nature, and just being able to connect with those experts in those areas, as well as what you're reading in some of the more public facing kind of trade publications as well.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to talk about there about, I mean, how we do that, get those experts, I think, in front of board members, I think is something to really think about. And it gets back to the notion of there are people who have expertise on it. And so, yeah, certainly as university president, I'll have people come up to me all the time, not necessarily my board members, but others saying, hey, you should do this. It works really well. And then I'll go to experts like you and I'll find out, like, well, actually, that doesn't work particularly well and is not necessarily a good idea or not good for our type of institution. It worked well at a elite private institution, but it wouldn't work well at a regional public. And so I think having access to expertise is good for all of us. So,
and I think that's the big thing. I think you make a really good point, is that you really have to think about what works at your institution and what does not work. And sometimes we just see something work in another institution, but we don't understand that regionality plays a role, their structure plays a role, their demographics play a role. And so tempering that is important.
So tell me a little about what you think are indications of a well-functioning board and maybe one that's not so functional, and any trends you're seeing related to either one of those. But so what does a well-functioning board look at, and what's we be concerned about?
Yeah. So I think the first is that you're not in the news. But
yeah,
that's just a joke. But I think a well-functioning board, one of the things I'll say that I find with boards that I think do well is that they have very clear processes for doing their work. Very clear processes. Those processes are communicated well to all members, that there is good onboarding and substantive onboarding. So it's not just a one retreat and you get a packet of information and you're thrown to the wind, but that there is really substantive teaching of board members of how to be board members, what information you need to be aware of, what are our practices here, what are our policies here. That onboarding is really important, I think, to having a really good functional board. And then I also think being able to having a really clear logics around how you make decisions, and knowing what that process looks like, and having a process that is democratic in nature. And what I mean by that is that persons have equal voice and vote, and are able to actually participate in discussion around decisions, and that those decisions are transparent. The other thing I'll say too that I think signals a healthy board is a healthy relationship with the president, particularly the board chair and the president. They should be working in tandem. The board chair and the president really are partners. And the board and the president are partners. I think when, if we're talking about signs of dysfunction, is when the board and the president, there's an imbalance in the relationship where either the board feels that the president is just simply an employee of theirs, or the president feels like the board is just an obstacle in their way. When those imbalances occur, you're going to have issues, because really, even though the president serves at the board pleasure of the board and the president are partners in leadership at the institution. And so I think another sign of dysfunction, if we're going that route, is when your board members are overly vocal. If you are seeing, and back to being in the news, if I'm hearing the voice of the board chair, board members more than I'm hearing the voice of the president, we're probably there's probably some challenges going on, because really board members shouldn't be the face of the institution, even though they are part of the leadership structure of the institution. And so I think boards that are high functioning understand that. I think they understand they step in when they need to, but that they shouldn't be the face of the institution, and also that that they shouldn't be bringing negative attention to the institution, I think. And then the last thing I'll say is a symbol of a high functioning board is that they are not in the weeds, what we say in the weeds, and that they understand that though they need to have information about what's happening on campus, they shouldn't be trying to manage who's doing what on campus. That is why they hired the president. And so really, I think when you see a board is acting a bit dysfunctional is when, you have board members who are calling up the athletic director and telling the athletic director what they should be doing, or are on campus because they want to see if faculty are in their rooms, things of that nature. I think then we've gone a little off the rails. So really, you want information about the campus, but you don't manage the campus. And so I think boards that understand that do well to be functioning well and at a high rate.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop because it leads really nicely into the discussion we'll have with the board members who are with me today. So Dr. Commodore, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you.
So next we have up our SIU System Board Chair, Judge Phil Gilbert, and former Chair Roger Tedrick, who's also served, and I think you chaired the Foundation Board at one point too. Yeah, sure. So he's been involved in multiple boards here at SIU. Please tell us a little bit about how you got appointed to the Board of Trustees here at SIU. I'll start with you, Phil.
Well, I was appointed in 2015, and one thing, you can't get appointed unless there's a vacancy. Mm-hmm. And we're appointed by the governor, and there was a couple of vacancies, and I've had, like Roger, we grew up literally with this university. I mean, we saw this university go from a teacher's college to a major research institution before our eyes were growing up. And so I've always had an interest in the university. My family has too. And I was approached by several people to consider being appointed to the board. So basically you have to notify the governor's office of your interest, and you have some people, legislators and things advocating for you. And I was fortunate to be appointed.
Yeah. Roger?
Well, this is my second time.
Yeah,
so
you've done it twice.
Yeah, I was served 8 years, and I was approached by a banker friend in my community that had worked hard to get the governor elected. And the governor called him and said, would you make a recommendation for a board member? So I had been involved in search committees for chancellors and athletic directors, and he called me and said, you'd be a natural for that. Would you have an interest? And I said, yeah, I would. Mm-hmm. So, and that's how it happened. So
how well did you understand the role of a governing board member before you were appointed, and how did you learn about it after your appointment, and anything that surprised you in particular? I'll start with you, Roger.
Well, that you have an onboarding process, and it was confusing. Uh-huh. I took the first time around, I kind of took a different tact in that I kept my mouth shut. And then when I'd have a question, there were always people you could go to in the university system that would be happy to help you. I was appointed finance chair, and we had a vice president for finance. I can't tell you how many trips I made here and sit down in his office. We talked one time about certificates of participation and our bonds and all those kind of things, and it was a learning experience. And you can ask your fellow board members too. Uh-huh. But more than anything, the president is very helpful in that.
Yeah.
Well, when I first came on the board, before I came on the board, I knew that board members hired top administrators, and having grown up in Carbondale and seen several presidents come and go, I knew that the board hired them and even fired them. But once I got on the board, and of course also being a judge, I knew about the legal aspect, because I had, before I was appointed to the board, I had several cases involving the university. So I knew that from a legal aspect, it was important that board members be informed as to the legality of what the SIU, what the institution's doing. But like Roger said, there's a lot that new board members don't know. Fiscally, I was not really aware. I came on the board, like I said, in 2015, where we were in a financial crunch. We were not getting adequate funding from the state, and we had to make decisions regarding cutting programs, and I was not used to that. But it was a learning process. But new board member, and also once I got appointed to the board, I'd have somebody call me up and say, "Hey, can you help my child get a job here?" And I say, "That's above my pay grade." Since board members don't get any pay.
Yeah.
and that's what Dr. Commodore talked about. There's a difference between governance and management, and it's important that board members know that distinction.
Yeah. No, it really does follow up nicely, I think, on what she was talking about. And I think, Roger, you were hitting on that, learning things so you're better informed to make decisions takes a little bit of time. And so going to, for example, the Vice President of Finance and finding out how do these things work. So by the time it gets to a vote, you're making an informed decision, I think follows up nicely with what she was talking about. And, the other thing that happens is issues always arise on the university campus. Like, how do you go about getting informed on the decisions and that, Phil? Or those issues, and Phil, I'll start with you.
Well, the issues that arise, like let's say on the Carbondale campus, I would, of course, again, I've been a member of two different boards. The first board I was a member of from 2016 to when Roger came on was basically there was a lack of communication. So in my standpoint, and from my viewpoint, I would call because I couldn't really trust the information I was getting out of the president, I would call the chancellor's office and try to get information there. But it's important that administrators communicate with board members when issues arise. The last thing that a board member wants to do is read something in a newspaper that they were not aware of and should have been aware of at the time that the issue may have arisen. But I've picked up the phone. I've called the chancellors. I've called you before, and to try to get information. Because, like Roger said, in order to make an informed decision, we need to know what all the facts are. But it's communication is the key to between the board and administration to a university that runs smoothly.
Yeah, Phil, you made a comment that I'd like to comment on. That is, you talked about the dysfunctional board you had. And going back to me being reappointed the second time, three of us had not been reappointed at one time. So we're all three back on the board. But I watched that dysfunctional board, and I felt bad for you guys. And there were openings, and people would approach me. I didn't want any part of it. But I got a call one day with this current governor. Their administration said, we would like you three to come back because we're tired of the campuses fighting each other. I want board members that work to strengthen the system. That was music to my ears. And this board has done that.
It sure has.
It has done a very good job.
And probably the one surprise to me when I came on the board in 2015 is the fact that the campuses did not communicate with each other. There was no collaboration or communication between Edwardsville and Carbondale, and that resulted in board members being parochial to their own particular campus and not system-wise. And when these new board members came on, and I was still a part of the board, it was a breath of fresh air to me, because there were times that I didn't sleep at night because I was worried about not only the Carbondale campus, but the whole system.
See, one other comment on that, and I want to point out, when we interviewed you, you had heard about the dysfunctional board, and you came, and we spent a lot of time letting you know that we wanted to strengthen the system. And that really sold you, I think.
Oh, absolutely. It was, again, I always say I knew very little about how boards worked. I learned a lot in my first presidency, and I was much more cognizant of finding the right board that I thought I could work with, and one that was functional, just as Dr. Commodore talked about. And I think one of the things I've heard the governor also said didn't want us in the headlines, which is exactly what Dr. Commodore said. It's like that's a sign of dysfunction is when you're in the headlines. That's not a good sign, and I think the governor's office recognized that, as did other people. So, Roger, I'll go with you to this question. What do you believe is particularly challenging for board members?
Knowing how academia works. You know, you think, well, we've got all of these colleges and we've got deans in them, and how does the chancellor make a decision? How does the president make a decision? And you learn how that all flows through. There is a process. It does work, and it just takes time to learn that.
Yeah.
Well, I would agree, because I didn't know what a provost did. I didn't know who, and knowing how the structure of the university works from the ground up is critical for the board member to understand what his or her role is as a board member in relation to the university strategic plan. And it's, but I agree with Roger on that. Knowing how the inner workings of the university is and the system and is very important to a board member.
Yeah, and you're right, it's very different. And you talk about the provost specifically, I always think it's funny. If you ask the average person, or even when I was an associate provost, I tell them I'm an associate provost, and they would just look at me confused, like they had no idea what my job was.
I didn't know what a provost was.
And it's such a critical piece.
Yeah, it is.
Because it really sees the academic side of the institution, so it's a key role at the institution, but I don't think the average person understands what that is. And so for someone outside, it's something you have to learn about. What might surprise people, Phil, about the role of a governing board, or about being chair specifically?
The time it takes, is one of the things. Yeah. The time it takes, it can be time consuming, and different at different times you're more busy than other times. But board chair has to be informed about the political aspect of it. The financial aspect of it. We have, like I said, we have a governor that's now that's very pro higher education, which is helpful to us. But another thing a board chair has to do is like Roger said, we need to learn to get together. We need to know each other, and we have a very balanced board. What Dr. Commodore has said is that it's important that board members get along with each other. But I think that board chairs, we just have to, it does take time. The communication with the president is critical. Like you said, we are partners. So you're my partner now. Right. And I think we work together extremely well. You keep us informed. You keep the other board members informed. And that makes running, and when I was on a dysfunctional board, the morale of especially the Carbondale campus was sinking, because they knew that there was dysfunction at the top. Now, when you talk to people on this campus, because the board is cohesive and working together, I think the morale here among staff and professors and stuff is better than it's been in many years. And it's because of the leadership from the top, from the administration, as well as the cohesive board.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think when you have a board that's, as we were talking with Dr. Commodore, that's dysfunctional, everybody feels it in some ways. It definitely can have an impact. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, when Phil talked about the time that it takes as board chair, that's right. And the interesting part that you learn about being a board chair is the board chair speaks for the board, and they're only one vote, and they are elected by the board. So it's not like they're autocratic. They're the ones that deal with the president on a day-to-day basis and keep the board informed, and it's worked very well.
Yeah, I think that's, and we were talking earlier, that's one of the things I've noticed in other boards. When I start seeing board members speaking away from the president, away from the board chair, you probably know you've got some concerns there. I think the time is also, I think most people underestimate how much time you all spend doing this. And it reminds me of one of my previous universities. Someone got elected to the board, And her mother turned to the provost and said, "Now, how much does this pay?" And they had a hard conversation that it wasn't going to pay at all, but it was going to be a lot of time. So it is really
It'll cost you.
Yeah, it's a service activity, very, very much so. So, Roger, I'll end with this question. What advice would you give to people new to governing board service, and particularly a new board chair?
Well, that's two different.
Yeah.
To a new board member, ask questions of your other board and get to know them. Pick up the phone, call them if you have a question, because they'll share that with you and learn to get along with them. As board chair, a new board chair, you got to work hard getting along with the president and your board and communicate with your board. I had a situation where I had some board members that were spirited, and I found out the best way to deal with them is face-to-face.
Yeah.
If we had an issue coming up, I'd go sit down in front of them, and they're human beings, and those things usually work the best.
Yep.
Well, I would agree. You know, we had a new board member come on in the last few months, and what I've done with every new board member, except Roger and the three that came on, because they knew more than I did, was I'd take them to lunch. I'd sit down with them and I say, okay, and they would ask questions, and then I say, you need to ask questions like Roger said. You know, ask questions to other board members. If you have a question regarding something about the university, regarding something to the chancellor or the president, you know, call them up, ask them. But it's critical that you be able to ask questions. But I've always sat down with every new board member, had lunch with them, and especially our student board members. One of them I had to have lunch with every month. And sometimes, you know, especially with we've been fortunate to have had some good student trustees, but we've had some that they came on with a personal agenda, and that's another thing.
Yeah.
You cannot come on the board with an agenda. The only agenda you should have is what's best for the system. Not what's best for any particular campus, not what's best for any particular program. What's the best for the system. And once you understand that, new board member understands that role, it makes it easier for a board chair to communicate with that individual.
Yeah, no, and I think I think both hit on again is, I always think good board members are intellectually curious and want to learn and go out of their way to make that extra effort, whether it's meeting with other board members. You talked about meeting with the vice president for finance so that they are, again, making those more informed decisions, and don't come onto the board with an agenda or think they already have all of the answers. And I think that's where you lead to more of the dysfunction. So I want to thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you. This has been fun.
Yeah.
Fun, yeah.
And thank you again to Dr. Commodore. Hopefully today's episode will inform you a little bit more about how governing boards work in higher education. Again, I think it's a mystery to many, but hopefully this is informative for you. So as we wrap up this episode, I want to acknowledge our production team on the Office Hours podcast, SIU Edwardsville graduate student Solomon Amandi, Larry Hunter, and the team here at WSIU Studios. And last but certainly not least, you, our listeners, thank you again for joining us today.
Be sure to join us next time on Office Hours for further conversation with the people who work in and study higher education. Special thanks to Kara Baldus-Merriman and Daniel Merriman for the use of their composition Writer's Block as the Office Hours theme song. And thank you for listening to Office Hours with SIU System President Dan Mahony.